thanks so much for this introduction and the nice warm-up. Yeah, hi everyone, good morning. My name's Schneider. I'm a senior analyst at Lufthansa Innovation Hub. And I'll give you a bit of an introduction into how we do research, how we create insights, and how we use that to uncover strategic blind spots at Lufthansa Group, right? And I'll start with now we can, okay, I'll start with a quick introduction. So our mission at Lufthansa Innovation Hub is to accelerate the next in travel. So our assumption is that the next in travel is yet to be built, right? We're a bit more future looking. We try and understand what's actually going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years vis-a-vis the daily operations, right? What's happening in corporate strategy the next year. So we try and look beyond that. And we do that through our 3 teams. Strategic intelligence, that's my team. We create, curate, and share insights. Then we have a new business team that aims to, quote unquote, realize the next. So this is where we partner with the startup landscape through vehicles like venture clienting, for example. But we also have actual hands-on venture developers that create startups, create project ideas, create business ideas on a frequent basis. Yeah, so we come up with new ideas all the time. We ideate, and then we go through like an entire validation process all the way to MVP as well. And then there's our 3rd team, the transformation team, which basically takes this information from the strategic intelligence side, from the new business side, and creates workshops and learning formats to foster a culture of innovation within Lufthansa Group, but also within the broader travel industry. Right, and within strategic intelligence, actually all our information is publicly available on tnmt.com. This has earned us some recognition, right? I think many of you will know, but there is a sweet spot in providing good information for free, right? It gives you good reach, and through our reach, we've actually managed to partner with a lot of very interesting outlets and are actually quite well-known thought leaders in the space of travel and mobility tech. Right. How we do things is a little bit specific, and I think it's very, very important for us, for our branding, for our reputation, to provide good information, not just opinions, right, but intelligence and data that founds the opinions that we put out there. And as all of you will know, creating any opinion should be based on data, should be based on the analysis of the data. So that's basically the first layer of everything we do when we put out an article and report an infographic. We start with an analysis. Afterwards, we synthesize the information, and then the holy grail comes in the genesis portion. By genesis, we typically talk about going from intelligence to action, right? So we have the information in front of us. We have some strategic implications, but what do we do on top of that, right? How do we get that information to the right people? Right, and I'll start with a couple of examples just to give you insights into how we do things and how we've used that in the past to uncover strategic blind spots, right? And yeah, this is, I think, probably one of my favorite slides in what we do. This is our indicator stack. So this is basically the long list of different databases, of different tools that we utilize. You'll see our lagging indicators that help us understand how current events, how certain dynamics have impacted the industry currently. And then you have our leading indicators there on the right, which try and help us forecast, right? Try and help us future-proof strategies, help us look forward, right? And in the lagging indicators, you'll see, for example, reviews. That's a big one. Social listening, so we use natural language processing, we use sentiment analysis to understand customer reviews, but only based on external data, right? So we're not plugged into the, let's say, data analytics infrastructure that looks at customer reviews that are specific to Lufthansa Group or that come in through internal survey mechanisms. We typically only look at external data, like, for example, TripAdvisor reviews, or we look at Reddit sometimes and see very interesting things being said about the airline industry and Lufthansa Group, right? In terms of leading indicators, one of the major very regular data sets we use is venture capital funding. Venture capital funding for us being somewhat the innovation capital in the travel industry, but also beyond the travel industry, right? Over the past 10 years, billions of dollars went into venture capital, and even though there's no direct line between, like, you know, a startup that raises billions and actual market change, it's very, very hard to make that direct connect based on the data. But we have seen venture capital change the travel landscape in a very long-lasting fashion. For example, through the emergence of new verticals like ride-hailing, right? Uber, Didi in China, or micro-mobility, right, have basically changed urban transportation in, you know, large cities in a very long-lasting fashion. And then there's, you know, this whole realm around vacation rentals, right? Started with Airbnb, then you have Vacasa, you have Home2Go, right? All of these players raise venture capital funding, and nowadays when I travel, most of the time I look for vacation rentals first, right? So definitely some very foundational changes that we've been able to track through venture capital, right? Then another interesting data set that we pull out of the hat once in a while is actually Wikipedia edits. So we started looking at Wikipedia edits as more of a, let's say, fun addition, you know, like a bit of a value add, a bit of an unconventional data perspective, which is something that we take pride in, unconventional analyses. And we started looking at aviation biofuels. So in the airline industry, sustainable fuels are a huge topic, basically the only current viable option for airlines to approach net zero operations, right? So sustainable aviation fuels is the way to go. There's a lot of stuff happening around it, but also a lot of challenges. But the media hype around sustainable aviation fuel started in 2021, late 2021. And when we started looking into this topic, we actually, just out of, you know, fun, we decided to look at Wikipedia edits as well. And turns out the Wikipedia page on aviation biofuel was heavily edited in 2020, so it could have potentially helped us, you know, forecast a trend here a little bit, since there are thought leaders, there are experts out there, right? They're building up a lot of academic knowledge, and they're sharing it through platforms like Wikipedia, right? Before the media, the mass market takes notice, right? Cool. So those are a couple of the tidbits, a couple of the data types that we use, you know, for any and every analysis that we put out there. But obviously, the more important portion comes in when you try and make sense of the information you have, right? And you try and understand, you try and prove some of these big assumptions that you have around how an industry is developing, right? And this is where triangulation comes in. Triangulation meaning the ability to use multiple data sources, multiple methods to create, like data reference points around a specific research question, right? You have a research question, you have an assumption, but you want to look more broadly than just one data set or one data type or one article to prove it. And this is how we go and look into some of the more foundational trends, some of the more foundational dynamics. And there's three aspects to triangulation. There's vertical triangulation, which basically tries to understand patterns in one data set or in one, let's say, data aggregation technique. Then there's horizontal triangulation, which looks at pattern strength across domains. At least that's how we would define it. So we look across industries, and we try and look and see if there's a similar dynamic across industries, right? And then there's temporal triangulation, as the name already says, looking at patterns over time. And I'll show you an example for each. Starting with vertical triangulation, I think one of my favorite analyses this year has been the traveler trends analysis. So independent of domain, independent of research realm, at the beginning of the year is, for I think many of us analysts, probably a very interesting time when all the big outlets come out with their traveler trends reports, right? In the travel industry, that's Expedia, that's Booking.com, that is TNMT.com as well, right? So everyone comes out there and says like, hey, these are the trends to watch, right? This is the new terminology that you have to watch. And many of these assumptions are based on data, right? So these providers look at their internal data, they look at their dynamics, and then they establish that now gig tripping is the new hype for 2025. And that's not inaccurate, right? But typically, it's a very granular and somewhat subjective view of the landscape. So what we did is we wanted to take a bit of a broader view, and we actually collected 36 traveler trends reports, and we used natural language processing to isolate key terms around trends. So we isolated 316 trends from these reports. We looked at the frequency, and then we clustered them, right? So we clustered them into 16 major clusters, the biggest of which were actually passion travel and mindful travel. Both of these, if you're in the travel industry, will not be new to you. These are terms that have been floating around for a long time, right? But the relevance for us was really to understand how does new hype terminology like gig tripping, like sports fan travel, like slow travel here in the mindful travel category, how does that intersect and how does that help us really understand some of the more foundational trends, right? Because a trend is not a trend if it disappears after a year, right? And this is how we started. This is probably what we're going to continue doing every year from now on, and then hopefully see, also some changes emerge throughout time, right, in terms of relevance. Cool. Then in terms of horizontal triangulation, the example I have for you is actually from the cruise industry. And this was, I think, one of the more high-profile analyses that we did this year because it's fairly new. Like typically, cruise ships don't compare themselves to airlines, but they should, because there's a lot of similarities. Both the airline industry and cruise ships operate these heavy assets. They are in operation for decades at a time, 30 to 50 years. You have to pre-order them 10 years in advance. And this significantly limits innovation in the space, right? Because by the time you get the aircraft or you get this completely new ship, the technology on there is already outdated by up to 10 years, right? And that is a huge cost factor to retrofit, to update these heavy assets, and it limits, innovation, or it limits, the speed of innovation to an extent, right? So there's a lot of parallels between airlines and cruise ships, and that's what we wanted to deep dive into, because obviously both industries were hit hard by COVID, by the pandemic. Cruise ships had a lot of negative press sentiment around, people being stuck on those cruise ships for months at a time, right? When the pandemic hit, people were getting COVID on these ships. It was this like black box of tragedy. So a lot of analysts at the time wondered if the cruise industry would ever return. And big surprise, it did. I don't know if any of you did a cruise vacation already this year, but we were really astonished at the speed at which cruise ships return, and the cruise ship industry returned even faster than the airline industry. You can see here on top. So our assumption was like, okay, let's look at why this is happening. Maybe it has something to do with innovation. Maybe it has something to do with technology. And the main data set that we used to look into this was patent data. So we looked at patent applications. And we did see like a very interesting dynamic where we saw that patent applications by major cruise lines actually accelerated in the early years of the pandemic, unlike in the airline industry where we just saw patent activity go down. And what we also saw is that the majority of these patents focus on the passenger experience here on the bottom left, which is also not the case in the airline industry, where the majority of patents goes into seat design. So definitely an interesting learning in and of itself. Okay, cruise ships are investing very heavily in the passenger experience, in entertainment options, in activity monitoring, in passenger health and disease prevention. So obviously we wanted to start extrapolating some learnings for the airline. And one of the major innovations that we see in some of these major cruise lines was the usage of wearables, the usage of bracelets. And this is, I think, a very interesting example of how innovation, or how the pandemic was somewhat a catalyst for innovation, because these wearables started out as contact tracing bracelets, right? So if you're on board, there's a way to sort of track who you've been in contact with and if that person was infected. But on top of that, cruise ships continue developing that and actually created like a whole array of very seamless functionalities on board the ship, including location tracking. If you want to get your food or your drink delivered to you, you can do that from anywhere on the cruise ship using your wearable. You can use it for payments, right? Tap to pay. You can use it for identification, room access, right? To enter your room, but also to enter lounges, as an additional experience, and also to embark and disembark the ship in some cases. And then there was very deep integration with the mobile app functionality as well, where you can book experiences in the mobile app and then access those experiences using the wearable. right? And even though in the airline industry, like, we won't start handing out bracelets, right? We won't start manufacturing them and handing them out at the airport. That's not going to happen. But these functional aspects are extremely relevant for the airport experience as well, right? It's a complex experience, a complex journey through the airport. You have multiple identification touch points. You have many retail options and offers in the meantime, right? So why not invest more heavily into developing applications or functionality for wearables such as the Apple Watch, yeah? So this was definitely one of the very interesting and more strategic pieces, even though it didn't start out that way. And then thirdly, temporal triangulation, looking at developments over time here. Extended reality is a wonderful example. We started experimenting with extended reality back in 2014 when you had these very basic headsets. You had to put your phone inside. There was like a phone app that you had to download, and then you could immerse yourself in this like very rudimentary version of virtual reality, right? That was back in 2014. But a lot has changed in 2024, where we started testing the Apple Vision Pro, which is still a bulky and a heavy device, and we're not all walking around with Apple Vision Pros on our heads, but the graphic quality has increased many times over. The navigational features are extremely sophisticated. The level of interactivity in this device is eons beyond what we had in 2014, right? So definitely an extensive development and trend momentum that we wanted to chart in the air travel industry as well. And this is where we actually started aggregating our own data or our own data sets based on external data still, right? We're not talking about internal data, but we actually started building out a platform that helped us source news content based on AI, curated news feeds, right? And we started pulling information on like what airlines were experimenting with what use cases. And interestingly enough, we saw that there were, first of all, more than 100 projects in the last 10 years, which for the airline industry and a new technology is not bad. And we saw that the majority of experimentation actually happened in 2024, so that's the highest point here in the bar chart. So actually must have been very much pushed by the excitement around the Apple Vision Pro, right? So a new device is on the market, and all of a sudden, airlines are jumping on the bandwagon and experimenting with new use cases. What was also very interesting is that we obviously dug a bit deeper into the use cases, we clustered them, and you see here on the left in gray, this is sort of the B2B, the operational side of things. Pilot training, crew procedure training. Now, training scenarios using virtual reality in the airline industry are already very common, especially for crew training, especially for engineering training. We've experimented, we've used simulations for pilot trainings for decades, right? So there's actually a pretty strong foothold in the aviation industry already using extended reality for training scenarios, right? But actually the bulk of experimentation was here on the right side in the customer, consumer use case bucket, right? So we saw a couple of very interesting things around immersive entertainment, around immersive product previews, right? And even though none of that has stuck necessarily, right? It's not a common place to have that at the airport or in the aircraft yet, but it was nonetheless a very positive development that we saw here, just simply because there is a lot of experimentation. There is already some knowledge that is built up based on that. And as the technology develops, we'll continue to see this experimentation, and we'll continue to see new use cases being developed. Cool. So this brings me to the Genesis component. The Genesis component, as I said, being taking this information and putting it, into the right heads, right, into the right hands. So coming from intelligence to actionable intelligence, right, being able to make and support decisions. And this is where we really started kind of talking about platformization, and where we started with experimenting with different ways of providing intelligence at different levels. And we started with push intelligence, right? Things like AI-curated news feeds, right? Things like automated newsletters, trying to push some very basic information around some of the events that are happening in the industry to different leadership levels, which is somewhat relevant, but we'll still get a lot of requests around more ad hoc or more niche types of ideas, products, developments. Then built on top of that, we created more of a pull intelligence mechanism, where we also created dashboards, where we created the ability to dive deeper into certain trends, to isolate actors, to isolate trends from the intelligence we had. And then, let's say, the holy grail on top of that is embedded intelligence, right? So that is kind of the direction that we want to move into, where we can provide platform, where we can provide data in a more seamless fashion, right? That is integrated into existing workflows. But that's currently, just in the idea stage for us. And the portal we built out is called Cortex, right? Cortex being sort of a nice summarization of trends. So we've experimented with different mechanisms for trend engines, but its main focus would be to provide thematic intelligence on the travel industry, going very deeply into air travel, trends like auxiliaries and bundling and airport journeys and retail at the airport and boarding and gate, right? So some of this very, very specific knowledge that we are very good at curating and that we want to now provide, to other portions of the Lufthansa group. And with that, I'll end it for today, right? Feel free to connect, let me know if you have any questions.